One of the most feared sights for a soldier is being out in the open with no cover, knowing the enemy can see you. Now imagine being forced to wear a uniform that practically screams, "Shoot me," first. In a war where rifles had become deadlier, faster, and more accurate than ever before, one army decided their men should be dressed like moving targets. This is the story of the Union Army's dumbest uniform. At the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861, the Union Army stepped onto the battlefield in uniforms. That made sense in Europe a century earlier, but made no sense at all in the forests, fields, and hills of America. The Union soldiers wore bright blue wool uniforms that could be spotted from incredible distances. These uniforms were not chosen because they made tactical sense, but because they fit with the long tradition of European armies that believed uniforms should be bold, easily identifiable, and full of national pride. For much of military history, visibility was not always a weakness. Before the rise of accurate rifles, battles were fought in tight formations where men marched shoulder to shoulder, moving as one large block of soldiers. In that type of warfare, it was more important to identify friend from foe than to hide. Armies used color, banners, and drums to keep order. If you saw a bright red or blue coat in the smoke of battle, you knew who you were supposed to follow. The British famously wore red, the French were known for their blue and white, and many other European powers followed similar traditions. The problem was that the Civil War was not fought with the same weapons or tactics as those earlier wars. By the 1860s, rifled muskets and balls had completely changed the battlefield. A soldier could now hit a target with deadly accuracy from several hundred yards away. That meant standing out in a flashy, brightly colored uniform was no longer a symbol of pride. It was an invitation to get shot. The Union Army, however, did not adjust quickly to this new reality. Instead, they clung to the old-fashioned idea that uniforms were a matter of appearance, order, and tradition. When Union troops marched into their first battles, they did so in uniforms that made them highly visible in every type of terrain. On a dusty field, their bright blue coats stood out against the brown earth. In the green woods, their uniforms clashed with the natural surroundings. Even in cloudy or foggy weather, their uniforms provided a clear target for Confederate sharpshooters. Soldiers who wore them became easy marks for men who were skilled with rifles and scopes. To make matters worse, early in the war, there was little uniformity even within the Union ranks. Some regiments experimented with colors that were even more ridiculous than the standard blue. There were flashy red trousers inspired by French zouaves, gaudy hats, and even elaborate trimmings. These outfits may have looked impressive during parades in northern cities, but on the battlefield, they were disastrous. Confederate soldiers quickly learned that these men were often inexperienced volunteer regiments, and they targeted them mercilessly. The bright colors acted like a signal flare, drawing enemy fire again and again. For the average Union soldier, the uniform wasn't just a problem because of its color. It was also heavy and uncomfortable. Made of thick wool, the bright blue coats were brutally hot in the summer and soaked through easily in the rain. The soldiers marching long distances often found themselves weighed down, sweating, and exhausted. On top of being easy targets, they were also miserable in their own clothing. Letters from soldiers complained about how impractical the uniforms were, especially for the new style of warfare that relied on cover, concealment, and mobility. Imagine crouching in the underbrush, trying to stay hidden from Confederate riflemen, who had the high ground. Your weapon is loaded, your heart is pounding, and you're waiting for the order to fire. But it doesn't matter how still you sit, because your bright blue uniform gives you away. The enemy doesn't need to see your face. All they need is that flash of color through the trees, and they know exactly where to aim. That was the reality for countless Union soldiers in the first years of the war. One of the clearest examples of how disastrous the uniforms were came at the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861. Union troops marched into battle not only in bright uniforms, but in mismatched outfits that sometimes resembled Confederate gray. The chaos of the battlefield, combined with poor visibility from smoke, caused massive confusion. Some Union soldiers fired on their own men, mistaking them for the enemy. Others became clear, open targets as Confederate sharpshooters zeroed in on the bright blue figures moving in the open. The result was one of the most humiliating defeats of the early war for the Union. Over time, the Union Army realized their mistake. As the war dragged on, they began issuing more standardized uniforms, sticking to the blue coats. But even then, the color blue remained a liability. Unlike modern camouflage, it offered no natural concealment. The reason it persisted was not because it was effective, but because it became a symbol of the Union cause. Blue versus gray became the simplest way to tell the two armies apart. The Union was unwilling to abandon the symbolic power of their color, even though it came at the cost of thousands of lives. This was not just a story about clothing, it was a story about how slow militaries can be to adapt to changing technology. The rifle had made colorful uniforms obsolete, but generals raised in the traditions of European warfare refused to accept that fact. They believed order, discipline, and appearance mattered more than survival. In a sense, they sacrificed practicality for pride. Soldiers on the ground paid the price for that arrogance. By the later stages of the war, the Union had improved its uniforms to be slightly more practical, but the core problem remained. The soldiers were still brightly visible, still weighed down by heavy wool, and still easy to spot from long distances. Confederate sharpshooters continued to exploit this weakness, and Union soldiers learned the hard way that no matter how brave or disciplined they were, their clothing made them vulnerable. The dumbest part of the whole story is that the problem was avoidable. Civilian clothing at the time often included earth tones and practical fabrics. Hunters and scouts already understood the value of blending in with natural surroundings. Even some militias experimented with less flashy uniforms. But the Union Army, locked in tradition and obsessed with appearances, refused to consider these lessons until it was far too late. The bright blue uniforms of the Union Army have since become iconic in paintings and photographs of the Civil War. They are remembered as part of the imagery of the era, a symbol of the soldiers who fought to preserve the Union. But behind the romanticized images lies a harsher truth. Those uniforms were one of the dumbest mistakes of the war. They made soldiers into bright blue targets in a conflict where concealment could mean the difference between life and death. The Civil War was not a European war. It was not a neat contest of formations marching across fields. It was brutal, chaotic, and fought with weapons that made old-fashioned uniforms suicidal. The Union learned that lesson the hard way, but by the time they adapted, countless men had already paid the price. And that's the story of the Union Army's dumbest uniform. If you want to hear more about the strange, overlooked, and downright ridiculous moments of history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. This was just the first part of the story, and there's much more to come. The Civil War was fought with a level of accuracy and deadliness that made old traditions dangerous, and nowhere was this clearer than in the Union Army's uniforms. Those bright blue coats, rooted in European pride and order, turned out to be one of the biggest gifts the Confederacy could have asked for. Confederate sharpshooters, many of whom were expert marksmen before the war even began, quickly realized the fatal flaw. A Union soldier didn't need to be noisy, careless, or unlucky to get spotted. He just needed to wear the clothes he was given. In the hills and forests where battles were fought, Confederate sharpshooters hid among the trees and brush, waiting for their targets. Their rifles, many of them rifled muskets with longer ranges, made it possible to hit a man from hundreds of yards away. The flash of bright blue cloth against the greens and browns of the natural landscape gave them a target so clear that it was almost unfair. With a steady hand and good aim, Confederate snipers picked off Union soldiers one by one. Each shot didn't just kill or wound, it spread fear through the ranks. Every soldier who heard the crack of a rifle and saw his comrade fall understood the cruel truth. The uniform itself was betraying them. It didn't take long for Confederates to see the psychological advantage. Hitting an officer or standard-bearer dressed in blue could throw an entire company into confusion. The Unionist reliance on visibility for order meant that the very thing meant to organize their men had become a beacon for enemy fire. Commanders in blue coats with polished buttons became prime targets, and sharpshooters made sure to eliminate them first. Once the leaders fell, chaos rippled down the line. The Confederacy, on the other hand, didn't burden its soldiers with the same mistake. In the early months of the war, Confederate uniforms varied widely. Some wore gray, some wore brown, and others wore homespun clothes dyed with natural materials like walnut husks, butternut, or local plants. These tones blended far better with the wooded hillsides, muddy battlefields, and smoke-filled skies of America. Confederate soldiers, whether by choice or necessity, often blended into their surroundings more effectively than their Union counterparts. This wasn't camouflage in the modern sense. but it was far less conspicuous than a bright blue wool coat. The irony is that the Confederacy didn't tea-settle on this style because of superior planning or tactical genius. It was largely out of necessity. The South lacked the industrial capacity of the North, and producing standardized uniforms in a single, bold color was not always possible. Many soldiers wore what they could get, whether it was supplied by the Army or stitched at home. These earth-toned clothes happened to serve them well, making them harder to spot against natural backdrops. What started as a disadvantaged lack of uniformity turned into a deadly advantage against the brightly dressed Union ranks. Imagine being a Union soldier on the front lines. You're advancing through a wooded ridge. Smoke from musket fire clouds the air, and the sound of cannon blasts echoes in the distance. You crouch low, trying to stay unseen, but it doesn't matter. Your blue coat gives you away instantly. Somewhere, hidden in the trees, a Confederate sharpshooter sees the flash of blue, steadies his rifle, and squeezes the trigger. You don't even know where the shot came from. The fear wasn't just that the enemy was skilled. It was that you were practically walking around with a target painted on your chest. Letters and diaries from soldiers in the Union Army reveal the frustration and despair caused by this flaw. Men wrote about how they envied the Confederates, who seemed to disappear into the background while they themselves felt exposed. The casualty rates told the same story. On many battlefields, sharpshooters did devastating damage to Union officers and infantry alike, exploiting the uniform mistake day after day. One of the clearest examples came during the Battle of Spotsylvania in 1864, when Union forces were pinned down by relentless Confederate sharpshooter fire. Soldiers wearing blue could barely lift their heads without being targeted. The famous Bloody Angle, where men fought for nearly 20 hours straight, showed just how vulnerable the Union Army was to accurate long-distance fire. Their uniforms made them easy marks, and Confederate sharpshooters took full advantage, picking off soldiers from tree lines and fortified positions. But this problem wasn't limited to a single battle. Across the war, the Union's visibility became a repeated weakness. Sharpshooters didn't need to wait for massive engagements to take advantage of it. Even during marches picket duty or small skirmishes, the bright uniforms acted like signals. A lone Union soldier walking along a ridge could be seen from incredible distances, while a Confederate soldier in butternut or gray blended into the earth around him. Some Union regiments did experiment with different uniforms. A few adopted darker shades or modified their coats, while others introduced more practical clothing when supplies allowed. But the overall look of the Union Army remained stubbornly blue, and this consistency, while it helped with identification also, meant there was no escape from the fatal flaw. Entire regiments marched into battle as glowing blue masses against the muted backdrop of the countryside. To Confederate sharpshooters, it was like shooting at silhouettes lit up against a screen. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. Union soldiers knew they were easier targets, and every march into battle carried that awareness. Even the bravest men understood that their chances of survival were lowered not just by the enemy's skill, but by their own army's choices. Soldiers often muttered about how unfair it was, but what could they do? To refuse the uniform was to risk punishment, and to wear it was to risk death. It was a cruel dilemma, forced upon them by commanders who valued tradition over adaptation. Meanwhile, Confederate sharpshooters grew into a legendary force. Many of them were backwoodsmen and hunters before the war, men who had spent years honing their skills in forests and fields. The war gave them the perfect opportunity to put those skills to use. They didn't need to waste bullets blindly. All they needed was a clear view of a Union uniform, and the rest was easy. Their success built confidence, and over time, sharpshooter units became some of the most feared elements of the Confederate Army. The Union's bright blue coats turned every battlefield into a lesson in stubbornness. Modern warfare was already beginning to demand concealment, camouflage, and adaptation to new weapons technology. But the Union clung to its traditions. Instead of learning quickly, they bled for the mistake. The Confederacy, lacking resources, ended up stumbling into a more effective style of dress one that fit the new realities of the war better than the industrial power of the North could imagine. It's one of the strangest ironies of the Civil War. The side with greater industry wealth and resources gave itself one of the dumbest disadvantages, while the side scraping together uniforms from walnut husks and homemade dyes ended up with a practical edge. The blue uniforms were supposed to be a symbol of unity and strength. Instead, they became a symbol of how an army can undermine itself with tradition. Even in the face of obvious evidence that the world has changed, the Union Army S-Bright uniforms weren't just a poor fashion choice, they were a fatal flaw. Confederate sharpshooters turned them into targets, exploiting them in ways that cost the Union thousands of lives and forced men to fight under a constant shadow of fear. The color blue may have been iconic, but on the battlefield, it was nothing short of a disaster. Picture the scene: a Union regiment marching through rolling hills, the morning mist still clinging to the ground. Their blue coats gleam like a river of color, sharp and striking against the greens and browns of the countryside. It looked impressive from a distance, almost theatrical, but in reality, it was a death sentence. Confederate sharpshooters perched in trees or concealed in brush didn't need to squint to find their targets. The soldiers in blue stood out as clearly as if they had painted bullseyes on their chests. The Confederate Army, despite its many shortcomings in resources, stumbled onto a strategic advantage almost by accident. Their uniforms, made from rough wool that was often dyed gray or brown, with whatever natural materials were at hand, weren't the product of careful design, but of necessity. Plant-based dyes, walnut husks, and even makeshift concoctions gave their uniforms an earthy look that blended seamlessly with the wooded terrain. Dusty roads and farmland where battles were fought. This wasn't camouflage in the modern sense, but it had the same effect. Confederate soldiers melted into the background, while Union troops in their polished blue coats marched like beacons into a hostile landscape. One Confederate sniper recalled later in life that spotting Union soldiers was so easy it almost felt hidden in a tree line, with his rifle carefully steadied on a branch, he could watch the bright blue coats shuffle through a field like ducks in a pond. Picking off soldiers became less about skill and more about patience. The Union Army unknowingly gave their enemies a psychological boost, with every casualty caused by such obvious exposure. The very color meant to unite and symbolize order was turning into a liability that chipped away at morale. The Union's lack of camouflage was more than just a battlefield disadvantage. It was a cultural blind spot. Military fashion up to that point in history valued visibility and recognition. Bright uniforms were used to help commanders keep track of their troops amid the smoke and chaos of battle. In Napoleonic Wars and other European conflicts, armies wore distinct colors so officers could distinguish regiments at a glance. But the American Civil War wasn't a set-piece European conflict. It wasn't fought on open plains with neat rows of troops advancing toward one another. Instead, it sprawled across dense forests, winding rivers, and uneven farmland. It was fought in places where a soldier in bright colors might as well be holding up a flag announcing his position. Imagine being a young Union recruit, dressed in heavy blue wool and marching into Virginia woodlands. The forest floor is littered with dead leaves, the trees thick enough to obscure movement, the shadows shifting constantly. You can't see the enemy, but you can feel their presence. Then a shot cracks through the air. A fellow soldier collapses beside you. Another shot follows, then another. You drop to the ground, but there is little cover, and you know that to the hidden enemy, your uniform is still giving you away. The Confederate soldiers you face might not even be trained sharpshooters, but the contrast between gray or brown uniforms and the natural background gave them an automatic advantage. It's worth noting that the quality of Union uniforms, which were often tailored from finer wool and dyed with more consistent methods, made the problem even worse. The bright uniform blue caught the eye even more sharply than the inconsistent, often faded gray of Confederate outfits. The Confederates, struggling with supply shortages, sometimes fought in mismatched clothing or jackets that had lost much of their color. Ironically, these imperfections helped them blend better with the natural environment, turning poverty into an advantage. The Union Army, however, was slow to recognize this fatal problem. Tradition and bureaucracy held back changes that might have saved lives. Generals raised in a European military mindset were reluctant to abandon the visible, orderly appearance of their troops. They viewed the uniform as a symbol of discipline and strength. To change it would mean giving up a part of the Army's identity, even if it meant exposing soldiers to needless danger. The Confederate use of cover and concealment turned the lack of Union camouflage into a nightmare. Snipers would position themselves in trees with wide views of roads or clearings. From there, they could wait for blue-clad soldiers to march into view. It didn't take a genius marksman to inflict damage. The Union uniform did most of the work by making its wearer stand out against almost every backdrop. A gray uniform against tree bark was hard to spot. A blue one was unmistakable. The impact of this disparity in uniforms rippled through the ranks. Soldiers on the Union side knew they were easier to spot, and this knowledge fed fear and hesitation in combat. Letters home reveal their frustrations. Some men complained about being sent into battle in what felt like painted coats that made them look like targets. Others spoke of their envy when seeing Confederate prisoners up close, noting how their drab clothing seemed more suited to survival. It wasn't just about sniper fire either. Even in larger engagements, the lack of camouflage cost the Union dearly. On fields where smoke from cannons and muskets hung low, Union officers found themselves exposed. Their bright uniforms didn't only distinguish rank within their own lines, but practically announced leadership positions to the enemy. Confederate shooters could easily focus fire on officers, disrupting the Union's command structure. The loss of visible leadership in the middle of battle could turn order into chaos, amplifying the dangers already created by their uniforms. The Civil War marked a turning point in how visibility on the battlefield was understood. Before then, the notion that a soldier's uniform should blend into the environment was almost unheard of. The Union's struggles, however, highlighted the flaw in that thinking. They learned the hard way that in modern warfare, being seen could mean being dead. Every casualty caused by their uniforms was, in a sense, self-inflicted. The Confederate Army may not have had the industrial resources of the North, but their necessity-driven, earthy uniforms gave them a cloak of invisibility that the Union soldiers could only envy. The bluecoats that once seemed like a proud symbol of unity became an anchor dragging them down in a war of attrition. They were in fighting just against Confederate bullets, but against the very uniforms they were ordered to wear. By the time Union leaders finally admitted their mistake, the damage was already done. The bright blue uniforms had soaked up too much blood, and entire regiments had been decimated under the watchful eyes of Confederate sharpshooters. What started as a proud symbol of unity had turned into a costly liability. Soldiers at the front had long been aware of the danger, but the upper command clung to tradition, bureaucracy, and pride. It was only after thousands of casualties and countless complaints that the Union Army began experimenting with adjustments. The first changes were small and hesitant. Rather than abandoning the iconic blue, they tried different shades, hoping a darker or duller tone would make soldiers less obvious in the field. Some units received uniforms closer to navy or slate gray, while others saw coats dyed with cheaper, less vibrant material that faded quickly. The problem was that none of these changes were consistent, and supply shortages only made the issue worse. A regiment might march into battle looking like a patchwork of blues, some glaringly bright and others muted. From afar, they still stood out, and to a hidden sniper, that was all that mattered. The Confederates, meanwhile, didn't need to change anything. Their drab grays and browns weren't the product of foresight or tactical genius. They were simply the result of limited resources and natural dyes. But these constraints turned into an accidental advantage. Even as the Union tinkered with its uniforms, Confederate soldiers blended into the woods, fields, and towns where the fighting raged. A Confederate scout moving through thick brush could vanish into the background, while a Union soldier, even in darker shades, was still far easier to spot. The delay in change also created confusion on the battlefield. War isn't just about fighting, it's about recognition. Soldiers needed to identify friend from foe quickly, often in the middle of smoke-filled chaos. As some Union regiments began adopting darker or grayish uniforms, cases of mistaken identity increased. Confederate troops in gray sometimes looked dangerously similar to Union soldiers wearing experimental outfits. In the fog of war, this led to friendly fire and hesitation. Commanders who were used to identifying their men by the bright blue of their coats suddenly found themselves squinting and second-guessing. The very attempt to solve the problem introduced new complications. Imagine being a soldier in 1863, standing in a tree line before an engagement. You're wearing a coat dyed in a darker shade, perhaps closer to black than blue. Ahead of you, smoke billows as artillery pounds the enemy. Through the haze, you see figures moving. Their uniforms look grayish, but in the shifting light, it's hard to tell. Do you fire or do you hold? This moment of hesitation, multiplied across hundreds of men, could mean the difference between breaking an enemy line or being overrun. The reality was that by the time the Union Army took these steps, their bright blue uniforms had already defined the war in the minds of many. Confederate sharpshooters remembered the early days when Union regiments marched like glowing targets across open fields. The Union soldiers themselves remembered the helplessness of being picked off before even spotting their attacker. Those memories stuck. Adjusting the uniform later did little to erase the symbol that bright blue had become, a mark of arrogance, stubbornness, and poor adaptation to the demands of modern war. Even the act of altering the uniforms carried an air of desperation. Soldiers knew that the high command had been slow to react, valuing tradition over their lives. For years, letters had been sent from the front, begging for changes, pointing out the obvious problem, and warning of the consequences. When change finally came, many soldiers treated it not as a relief, but as an insult. It was proof that their lives had been needlessly wasted. The soldiers who had died in bright coats had paid for a lesson that should have been obvious from the beginning, and the irony was hard to ignore. The Union Army had the advantage of industry, resources, and supply. They could have produced uniforms in less conspicuous shades from the start. They had the factories, the dyes, and the logistical capability to outfit an entire army. But tradition blinded them. European warfare had glorified visibility, order, and distinction. Armies marched in colors not just to fight, but to be seen. In adopting those values, the Union ignored the reality of their own war. One fought not in neat, rows across open plains, but in forests, swamps, and broken countryside where invisibility mattered more than pageantry. When the war's stories were told, the Union's bright blue uniforms became one of its most ridiculed symbols. Soldiers wrote about them in memoirs, mocking the choices of their leaders. Confederate veterans later recalled how easy it had been to spot their enemies. Even historians looking back would cite the uniform as one of the war's clearest examples of how outdated traditions clashed with new realities. It was a costume change that came too late to matter. What makes the story even more tragic is how it reflected a larger theme of the Civil War. Adaptation came slowly, and it often cost thousands of lives. The war introduced new technologies and strategies rifled muskets, trench warfare, and railroads that demanded fresh thinking. But time and again, both sides clung to old ways until reality forced them to change. The Union's bright blue uniforms were just one part of a larger pattern. Like generals ordering frontal assaults against entrenched positions, or cavalry charging into rifle fire. The uniform symbolized a stubborn refusal to adjust until failure left no other option. Had the Union embraced camouflage or duller uniforms earlier, they might have saved thousands of lives. They might have denied Confederate sharpshooters the easy advantage that demoralized regiments in the war's early years. They might have shown their soldiers that their survival mattered as much as their appearance. But history doesn't deal in might have. By the time the Union Army altered its look, the blue had already left its mark not just on the battlefields where soldiers fell, but on the memory of the war itself. The cost of the Union Army's bright blue uniform can be measured in blood. From the very first campaigns, when men marched into battle wearing coats that practically screamed their position across the fields. The Confederacy capitalized on this mistake. Soldiers who might have lived to fight another day instead became targets for sharpshooters, hidden behind trees, fences, or stone walls. For the men in the ranks, the uniform was not just clothing, it was a sentence. The color that was supposed to unite them as one army became the very reason so many of them never came home. The early defeats of the Union can be tied in part to this blunder. While not the only factor, it was one of the clearest examples of how unprepared the Union was for the kind of war it found itself in. European wars had glorified brightly dressed soldiers marching in step, their uniforms helping distinguish friend from foe in smoke-filled battlefields. But the Civil War was not fought in the manicured fields of Europe. It was fought in forests, swamps, and farmland, where rifles could drop a man at hundreds of yards. Bright uniforms didn't signal discipline anymore. They signaled death. Take the first year of the war as an example. At battles like Bull Run, Union troops marched in with confidence, their polished blue coats making them look like a professional army. But that very appearance drew the eye of every Confederate marksman who had learned to melt into the countryside. From treetops, hedgerows, and farmhouses Confederate sharpshooters picked off Union soldiers with chilling ease. A Union regiment could lose dozens before they even knew where the fire was coming from. Soldiers began to associate the bright blue with helplessness, with the sinking feeling of being exposed while the enemy remained hidden. It wasn't just the dead who paid the price. Survivors bore the scars, both physical and psychological. Imagine being a young soldier, marching in formation, only to see the man next to you fall, struck down by a bullet from nowhere. Over and over, this happened, until it was impossible to ignore that the very thing you wore on your back made you a target. Morale crumbled. Soldiers wrote home bitterly about their uniforms, some joking darkly that they were dressed like bullseyes for the enemy. Others were less humorous, outright pleading for change. The letters that reached politicians and generals painted the same picture. The bright blue was a liability. Yet the Army moved slowly, weighed down by tradition, pride, and bureaucracy. While the Confederate soldier blended into the trees in gray or brown, the Union soldier stood out like a torch in the night. The refusal to adapt quickly enough made the war bloodier than it needed to be, and that refusal went deeper than uniforms. The bright blue coats symbolized the mindset of the Union leadership in the early years, a clinging to old ways, a reliance on appearances over practicality. In a world where rifles had greater accuracy and range, where sharpshooters changed the very nature of battle, leaders still believed that colorful uniforms were necessary to inspire discipline and order. They did not realize that the very things that once inspired confidence now invited disaster. The casualties mounted. At Antietam, Fredericksburg, and countless smaller skirmishes, the Union blue continued to draw Confederate fire. Even when uniforms were modified duller shades, cheaper dyes, it was too late. The reputation of the blue coat as a death sentence had already taken root. It was not just a matter of fabric or dye, but of perception. Soldiers entered battle already convinced they were at a disadvantage, and that mindset can be just as deadly as any bullet. The Confederates, for their part, saw the bluecoats as easy targets. Memoirs from Confederate veterans often mention how obvious Union soldiers were in the field. One sharpshooter recalled that spotting a Union regiment advancing was like watching a line of bright flags moving through the trees. That image speaks volumes. While the Confederacy struggled with shortages of food, weapons, and equipment, they enjoyed the unearned advantage of facing an enemy that practically announced its presence with its wardrobe. In hindsight, the Union uniform became a textbook example of poor military adaptation. It wasn't just about the bright color, it was about how slow the Army was to change when reality demanded it. War punishes delay, and in this case, the punishment was paid in blood. Thousands of men became casualties of a decision that should have been corrected before the first shot was fired. When people today look back on the Civil War, they often remember the blue and the gray as defining symbols. But for those who wore the blue in the early years, it was not a proud symbol. It was a reminder of leadership that valued tradition over survival. The Confederates may have lacked resources, but their muted uniforms fit the war they were fighting. The Union, by contrast, paid for its stubbornness with lives that could not be replaced. And that's the dumbest part of the story. The Union had the resources to do better. They had the factories, the dyes, the cloth, and the logistical system to outfit their men in uniforms suited to the battlefield. But they chose not to, at least, not until the cost had become undeniable. By the time adjustments were made, the early chapters of the war had already been written in blood, and the bright blue uniforms were forever tied to unnecessary loss. History remembers victories and defeats, but it also remembers blunders. The Union Army's bright blue uniform was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a fatal fashion choice, a decision that put thousands of men in harm's way and showed how slowly armies can adapt to change. It stands as one of the clearest lessons of the Civil War, that stubbornness in the face of new realities can be deadly, and that's why the story of the Union's dumbest uniform is remembered today not as a tale of pride, but as a price paid in blood. If you enjoyed this dive into one of history's strangest and most tragic mistakes, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian so you don't miss the next story about how the smallest decisions can shape the fate of nations.